There are places you haven't even set foot in yet, but your body already knows you don't belong. Not because of warning signs, not because of barbed wire fences, but because of a vague, unshakable feeling, as if the ground beneath you is quietly telling you to turn back, while you still can. Red Hollow is such a place. It lies deep within the forests of Tennessee, where afternoon fog falls earlier than the glow of streetlights, where old dirt roads lead you step by step into the woods, then silently erase the footprints you just left behind. Locals say Red Hollow is not a place to test one's bravery, because there are things that, once you walk in, ensure you will never be quite the same again. In the summer of 2003, 4 young people saw Red Hollow as a harmless destination. A short trip, a final camping getaway, before each of them went their separate ways in life. They brought backpacks, food, laughter, and the very ordinary hopes of youth. Then, they disappeared. No messages left behind. No signs of struggle. No clear explanation. All that remained was the silent forest, and a name that would henceforth be spoken more softly than usual. Red Hollow. The place where 4 people walked in, and no one ever saw them walk out. Josh Raburn was 19 years old, the oldest of the group. Tall, broad-shouldered, and sparing with words, he was always the one who stepped forward when something needed to be done. Josh had just bought a used SUV with money he had saved from years of part-time work. To him, that car was more than transportation. It was his first real marker of adulthood. In just a few weeks, Josh would leave the small town behind to start college. This trip felt like a quiet farewell to childhood. Ryan Raburn, Josh's younger brother, was 17. More reserved than his brother, Ryan preferred books to crowds, listening to speaking, observing rather than explaining his thoughts. In the eyes of the family, Ryan often lived in Josh's shadow, but to his brother, Ryan was the one who understood him best. The brother who stayed close without needing many words. Amy Collins was 15, the youngest of the group and their cousin. She carried a camera in her backpack because she loved capturing moments. Amy laughed easily, talked often, and had a habit of photographing the smallest details. To her, the camping trip was simply a beautiful summer memory. One more carefree moment before school and responsibilities took over. Caleb Collins, 18 years old, was Amy's older brother. He was the most energetic of the 4, and the one who suggested the trip in the first place. Caleb loved the forest, loved the feeling of freedom, and believed that short journeys had the power to bring people closer together. The 4 of them were not just cousins and siblings. They grew up together, sharing the same childhood memories. None of them could have known that this trip would become the last memory the world would ever have of them. That afternoon, Route 19 was as quiet as it had always been. A small gas station sat along the red dirt road, familiar to locals and rarely noticed by passing strangers. The 4 of them stopped there, only to buy a few ordinary supplies for the short camping trip ahead. Security footage recorded the moment at 5:46 p.m. The images were clear. Nothing strange or unsettling. Josh walked in first, moving slowly, as he chose what they needed. Ryan stood near the door, absent-mindedly looking outside. Caleb chatted and laughed with the cashier. Amy held her small camera, lifting it to capture a quick snapshot, a moment no one imagined would become so precious. They bought water, firewood, and a few snacks. There was no rush, no hint of tension. Just 4 young people enjoying a summer afternoon before heading into the woods. When they walked out of the gas station, none of them looked back. No one knew the camera had just captured the last images of them. An ordinary moment, and also the final moment the world could be certain that all 4 of them were still safe. Night fell over Red Hollow faster than anyone would expect. The air had been heavy and hot all day. But once the sun disappeared behind the mountains, the weather shifted abruptly. The rain was not heavy, but persistent, each drop cold and weighted. Fog followed, rolling in to cover the narrow trails, wrapping itself around tree trunks, turning the forest dense and opaque. Paths that felt familiar during the day began to change in the darkness. Sound was swallowed by the mist. Distance became difficult to judge. In Red Hollow, night was not just dark, It carried a powerful sense of isolation. A farmer who lived nearby later recalled that around that time, he heard the sound of metal coming from the forest. It was not a loud crash, but something heavy and slow, as if an object were being dragged across wet ground. The noise appeared, faded, then repeated a few times, blending into the rain and the hum of insects. He stood still for several seconds, uneasy, then went back inside. That night passed like any other. No one knew that, within the rain and thick fog, a chain of irreversible events had already begun. Sunday passed slowly. No calls, no messages. At first, the families assumed it was just a trip in the forest, where cell service was known to be unreliable. That thought was enough to ease the worry, at least for a few brief hours. But as night fell, the silence began to take on a different shape. The phones remained still. No vibrations, no glowing screens. Unease crept into every room, into every conversation that trailed off, unfinished. By Monday morning, worry had grown into fear. When the family's phone suddenly rang, it was Ryan's number. The call lasted only a moment. There was no voice on the other end, only distorted, broken sounds, like wind whistling through metal, like breath trapped within a weak signal. Then the line went dead. In that instant, any fragile hope collapsed. Because sometimes, the most frightening thing is not hearing a cry for help, but knowing someone is trying to call and cannot say a single word. That morning, police found Josh's SUV parked quietly at the entrance of the trail leading into Red Hollow. It sat there as if it were simply waiting for its owner to return, a thin layer of dust coating the body, with no signs of disturbance or chaos around it. The key was still in the ignition. The doors were closed carefully. No signs of forced entry, no evidence of a struggle. Everything looked so ordinary it was unsettling, as though the four of them had stepped away from the vehicle for just a few brief minutes. But when the doors were opened, the abnormality became clear. Inside the SUV, there were almost no fingerprints. Not on the steering wheel, not on the door handles, not on the dashboard. Aside from Josh's prints, everything else appeared to have been deliberately wiped clean. For investigators, this detail made the atmosphere immediately heavier. Nature can hide traces. Weather can wash away evidence. But the near-total absence of fingerprints suggested something else entirely. Intent, human interference. That SUV, once a small source of pride for Josh, now became the first question in a chain of mysteries with no answers. It stood there, in silence, as if holding on to something no one could hear. Not far from the SUV, search teams discovered the campsite the four had chosen. It lay tucked among tall trees, the ground damp, the air heavy with the smell of decaying leaves and cold mist. At first glance, everything looked as if it had just been set down and then forgotten halfway through. The tent was still inside its bag. Not set up. Not unzipped. The stakes had never touched the ground. As if someone had planned to continue, and then stopped suddenly. The food remained sealed in its packaging, unopened, uncooked. Wet firewood was scattered nearby, never ignited. There were no signs of panic, no belongings thrown about. That unusual neatness was more chilling than any scene of chaos. It suggested that everything had been halted at a very specific moment. On a nearby rock, police found an old phone. Its screen glowed faintly, the battery nearly drained. From its small speaker came a steady, distorted sound, like lifeless static cutting through the deep forest. No calls, no messages, only that sound, echoing in the empty space. This campsite did not feel like a place people had just left. It felt like a stage, where the people were gone, but all the props remained, waiting for something that would never return. The search began that same day, expanding hour by hour. Tracking dogs were brought into the forest early, their noses close to the damp ground as they followed the trail leading deeper into Red Hollow. In the first moments, there was still hope. The scent was there. The trail was fresh. Then, after roughly 200 meters, the dogs slowed at the same time. They stopped completely, circling in confusion. The scent vanished abruptly. As if someone had snapped the final thread, connecting the four to the outside world. It didn't fade, it was cut off. Search teams continued to widen the area. Helicopters flew low over the canopy. Voices calling out names echoed briefly before being swallowed by trees and fog. Red Hollow remained silent, indifferent to human panic. Amid the stalemate, a small detail emerged. A damp, crumpled piece of paper, caught beneath fallen leaves. Most of the writing had washed away, leaving only two readable words. South Path. No date, no name. Just a single direction, lying alone within the vast forest. For those searching, the scrap of paper was both hope and fear. It was proof the four had once been there. But it was also a sign that beyond this point, every trace seemed to belong to Red Hollow alone. When the forest gave no answers, those left behind could only wait. Josh and Ryan's parents sat in the familiar kitchen where the two brothers had grown up. Yellow light spilling over the old wooden table, every sound was kept low. As if someone feared disturbing something fragile hanging in the air. Each time a phone buzzed, their hearts tightened, and each time it was not their sons, the silence grew a little heavier. Amy and Caleb's father barely left the search area. He stood for hours at the edge of the forest, eyes fixed on every group that emerged, hoping to recognize a familiar face. Their mother clutched her daughter's jacket, as if the warmth still trapped in the fabric might be enough to pull her back. In the early days, everyone believed the children were simply lost. That they would turn up in a nearby town. Hungry, exhausted, but alive. That hope kept them standing. It helped them answer the same questions over and over from police and volunteers, but time does not stand still. With each day that passed without news, hope did not vanish all at once. It only thinned, like a thread stretched too far, and in that long waiting, the most painful thing was not despair, but not knowing how long one would be forced to wait. After the searches faded, Red Hollow was no longer spoken of as an ordinary forest. Its name began to surface in whispers, in voices lowered whenever someone passed the road leading into that valley. Locals claimed that compasses would spin wildly deep inside the woods. Radios carried in would dissolve into harsh static, as if something were forcing its way between the frequencies. Hunters familiar with the land avoided the area, saying animals did not seem willing to stay there for long. Birds flew over it, but rarely landed. The forest was still alive, yet that life carried a cold, distant feeling. Red Hollow slowly took on the shape of a curse. No official ban was ever placed, yet few people chose to return. Because whenever they thought of the four who vanished there, it felt as if the forest had not only taken their bodies, but had kept the answers as well. As years passed, the story was worn down by time. But the unease remained. Red Hollow was still there, silent, as if waiting for someone brave enough to step inside, only to add another name to the secret it had never released. Time passed long enough for many to believe that Red Hollow had sealed away its secret. The town changed. A new generation grew up. The names that once filled the news slowly became unfamiliar. But on the internet, some stories do not disappear. They simply wait to be told again. 22 years after the four young people vanished, a series of podcasts about unsolved cases unexpectedly brought up the name Red Hollow. Old case files were digitized. Faded photographs were uploaded online. Questions that seemed long asleep were asked again, this time by people who had never lived through the fear of that year. The interest spread rapidly. Thousands of comments. Millions of listens. Each episode pulled Red Hollow out of the dark, forcing it into the gaze of the wider world. Public pressure grew, and eventually, the case was reopened. For the families of the four, the feeling was both familiar and painful. Hope returned, no longer as fierce as before, but strong enough to make their hearts tremble once more, because as long as the story is told again, it means someone still believes the truth has not completely vanished beneath the silent forest floor. Everything changed with a single step off the familiar trail. While hunting, a man noticed an unusual collapse in the ground at Red Hollow. The layer of decaying leaves had been disturbed. The soil softer than the surrounding area, as if something had once been buried there and hastily covered up. When authorities began to dig, the smell of damp rot mixed with cold earth rose into the air. After only a short distance, they uncovered the first fragments of bone. No deep expertise was needed to understand that these were not animal remains, human bones, lying close together, entangled with clothing long since decayed by time. Later examinations confirmed the truth. They were Josh and Caleb. The revelation struck the waiting families like a final blow. Whatever fragile hope remained collapsed, giving way to a grief that was no longer abstract, but had shape and weight. But Red Hollow was not finished yet. As the excavation continued deeper, a large object slowly emerged. It was an old maintenance truck belonging to the local service department. Buried many years earlier, its body was rusted, the doors warped, as if it had once endured immense pressure in a confined space. Inside the vehicle, investigators found 3 mobile phones. They no longer resembled what they once were. Plastic and metal had melted and fused together into a single, inseparable mass. No one could explain why the phones were there, and even fewer could explain what had happened beneath the ground, powerful enough to twist them into such distorted shapes. At Red Hollow, the silence was finally broken. But what was revealed made many wish that some secrets had remained buried forever. The forensic report was released in the heavy silence of a small conference room. No cameras, no rapid-fire questions, only cold lines of text, enough to change everything people believed about that night in Red Hollow. The cause of death was determined to be carbon monoxide poisoning. A gas with no smell, no color, slipping into human lungs in absolute silence. It does not cause pain immediately. It does not warn its victims that danger has arrived. And for that very reason, it is more terrifying than almost anything else. What troubled investigators the most came next. Marks on the bones and the positions in which the bodies were found indicated that they did not die instantly. The 4 were conscious for a brief period, short, but long enough to understand that something was wrong. They tried to move, tried to find air, tried to escape. In darkness and confined space, the dizziness crept in slowly. Headaches, nausea, vision fading, awareness slipping away like sand through open fingers. There were no clear screams, only a quiet confusion and a fear without a name. When their final breaths left their bodies, Red Hollow returned to its original silence. A silence that had lasted for 22 years, concealing the truth that those 4 had fought until the very end, alone, and holding on to the fragile hope that someone would still find them in time. Just when it seemed the truth had finally been fully revealed, Red Hollow opened yet another layer of secrecy. While re-examining the area around where the truck was buried, investigators discovered shoe prints that did not match any of the 4 victims. They were pressed deep into dried mud, offset from the main trail. Larger in size, a different tread pattern. Most chilling of all, their direction led away from the area, not toward it. That meant one unsettling possibility. Someone else had been there, and that person left last. Timeline analysis showed that the footprints appeared after the night the 4 went missing. They did not belong to search teams, not to any recorded hunters, and they matched none of the individuals who had been questioned. Someone had returned to Red Hollow, likely after things had quieted down, when the town's attention was no longer fixed on the forest. The most painful question was not who that person was, but what they had done. Had they stumbled upon the truth by accident, then fled in fear? Or did they know exactly what lay beneath the ground, and chose silence for more than 2 decades? Those footprints do not speak, but they shatter the assumption that Red Hollow was only an accident. They suggest that in this story, there may have been a witness, someone who walked into the forest, saw what the world did not, and then turned away, leaving the truth buried for another 22 years. After all the painful discoveries, the Red Hollow case was finally brought to an official conclusion. Investigators announced their ruling. The deaths of the 4 were a tragic result of carbon monoxide poisoning in a confined space, with no sufficient evidence to prosecute any other individual. On paper, everything was neat, clear, and logical, but a sense of closure never arrived. The questions remained, hovering between the lines of the final report. Who buried the truck? Who returned to the forest after that fatal night? And why no one spoke up for 22 years, while 4 families lived in waiting and anguish? For authorities, the file was closed so time could move forward. For the families, it was only the end of a search, not the end of pain, because the truth they received was only part of the story, and the rest now belongs forever to Red Hollow. The forest still exists, still green each summer, still cold when the fog rolls in. It is neither sealed off nor erased from maps. But for those who suffered loss, Red Hollow has never truly opened again. It closed in on itself. Much like the case file, complete in legal terms, yet missing the answer people long for more than anything else. Today, Red Hollow still lies there, quiet, as if it had never swallowed 4 young lives. The road leading into the forest remains open. The wind still moves through the tall trees. Without knowing the story, one might think it is only a peaceful valley, a place where nature follows its own slow rhythm. But for those who have heard what happened, Red Hollow is no longer just a place. It is a reminder that there are places which do not welcome humans, even without warning signs, that nature can be silent and still not be harmless. 4 young people entered that forest with laughter, with the simple belief that they would return. What they left behind was not only an unresolved case, but a void that stretches across generations. Dinners with an empty seat, phone calls that never ring, holidays that are never quite complete. Red Hollow today no longer makes headlines. But whenever the fog settles in, when darkness falls earlier than expected, the story comes alive again. In the memories of families, in the quiet caution of locals, and in the questions that never received a full answer. Because some secrets do not disappear with time. They merely fall asleep, waiting for someone to listen, to remind us that sometimes the most frightening thing is not the darkness in the forest, but the silence that lingers long after everything is over.